Hello, everybody. How are we all doing? It is just me today. How about that? It's 𝗕𝗵𝗴𝗶𝗴𝗴, and we are going to be talking about the new changes coming up in the summer. We are now in the latter part of, well, we're in February 2024. And there are going to be some changes about serviced accommodation or short-term lets that they're known as, or holiday cottages or Airbnb. The list is endless. And it is going to be some planning changes and potentially going from C3 potentially to C5. There are some other bits and pieces that we're going to talk about over the next hour. But there will be a new planning use class C5. So if you have serviced accommodation, or if you are thinking of doing it, or if you're buying to do serviced accommodation, then it's really useful to understand this. And for a lot of people, I know that this is going to be really scary. It's like, these changes are coming up. What are we going to do? What is happening? So what this will do is hopefully to alleviate your fears, because of course, the more you know, then the more you understand, the more you can, change things if you need to. But inherently, I always think that as long as you're doing things professionally, you are running your short-term rental in the correct way. So for instance, you've got the correct FAR regulations, you obviously give a great service, you do as the local council require you to do, then we shouldn't be frightened by something like this. So if we look at the HMO model, that also used to be kind of unlicensed, so to speak. It didn't used to have its own use class. It now has a number of use classes, and people are still running and successfully investing and having the strategy of making money through HMOs. So it's not like serviced accommodation, this is the end of it. Because I know some people are like, oh, this must be the end. But honestly, it is not the end. I actually think it's a really, really great opportunity for those of us who really educate ourselves around short-term rental. And we ensure we give a great product, a great service to our clients, to our end guests, and make sure that our properties are really up to standard. So with that in mind, it means that, it shouldn't be something that is scary. But as they say, forewarned is forearmed. And so it is incredibly important that we do still understand what this means, and what may come of it. Now, I think the most important thing to start with is nothing is confirmed yet. And as we know with the government, things can change, but it looks pretty certain that some form of this kind of planning requirement will go through in the summer. Again, no dates, but it's coming through in the summer. And it is talking about a C5 use class. And it is talking about permitted development currently. So obviously we'll sort of work through our way with that to kind of understand what that means, and where that works. So yeah, I can see I've got a few people jumping on. I just want to check if anyone could write me a hello, or I can hear you. That would be really helpful. I'm just waiting just to confirm that. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I follow a fantastic town planning expert called Jonathan. Oh, thanks. Oh, thanks, Daryl. Thanks, Naomi. Fantastic. Thanks, Mirren. I love that. Otherwise, you feel a bit lonesome when you're here. But yeah, so I follow Jonathan McDermott of Town Planning Expert. we will have a link to him on this as well. He's absolutely brilliant, by the way. If you need any planning expert stuff, once this is in place, I'm hopefully going to be interviewing him as well, because he will give a really, really great introduction to this. Thank you, Olu. Oh, brilliant. Chris is saying, nice hat. Love it. Yes, it's one of my crazy bobbly ones. So Jonathan McDermott, what I'm going to do is he has put out, it's in YouTube, so you can go and watch it afterwards. And I'm just going to talk a bit about what he talks about. And as I say, if you do need him, so I might as well give him a plug. Not that I'm affiliated to him at all, but he does do these fantastic triage appointments, and you get like half an hour for not very much money. And I've used him multiple times. Really handy if you're kind of like, you've got a situation and it's a little bit awkward or difficult, or you're just new to planning, because we don't know everything and it's a really complex world. But he is absolutely brilliant. So what I'm going to do is I'm really going to talk through the sort of things that he's been talking about, and just generally what's out there, and really helping us understand why we shouldn't be frightened by this and why we should be running with this. And in fact, if you are new to this, why you should literally be running into it, because there's something called grandfather rights that we're going to talk about. And if you're already in serviced accommodation, then you're in a good position at this particular time. Okay, if you have any questions, do feel free to just drop them in the chat as well as we go through, and I'll do my best to get them answered. And as I'm here on my own, I will be drinking. If you watch me, I do drink an awful lot. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I am going to start sharing my screen in a moment. But yeah, just first things first about this serviced accommodation, short-term rental, holiday lets, all of these things. So there's been an awful lot in the news recently. And one of the stats, and I'm literally just taking this out of, I think it was a BBC News piece, and it says in England, holiday lets have risen by 40%, 40%, between 2018 and 2021. So that's absolutely enormous, isn't it? So you would imagine that potentially over the COVID time, that may have dropped back or anything like that. But for me, my business absolutely exploded the year of COVID, because the country still carried on. We all still had to live, and, you know, roads still needed to be built and building sites still carried on. So there was, and all the hotels shut. So actually my business really boomed. So between 2018 and 2021, it's increased by 40%. So that is really huge. And as you can imagine, that can have some knock-on effects. So especially when you look at places they mentioned, you know, Cornwall, the Lake District, Norfolk, massive touristy areas. And what they're saying is that is potentially having a knock-on effect on local people being able to rent or buy properties, because everything is going to serviced accommodation. Now, on top of that, there is a hi Jasho, there is something that they have been asking. They just don't know the extent of short-term rental or serviced accommodation in the UK. It is a little bit overwhelming for them, because people can pop things on Airbnb, they can, you know, go on just local websites and rent their properties out. So basically the government, local councils are a little bit overwhelmed. They don't have the knowledge that they need. And that's why, as I say before, with things like HMOs, they bought in this licensing, they bought in the planning permission, so that they can also keep in control. Also, I'm sure make a bit more money. But it is really important that, you know, when you're offering a product, that it's a great product. So again, this shouldn't be seen as a scary scenario. And it's actually really important that we just understand it for what it is. So what I'm going to do is just jump in and explain. So let me just share my screen. See if I can manage the tech here. Oh yeah, this is going to happen. Fantastic. Okay, can people see that? I think that's potentially going to be a little bit small, but we may have to run with it. It is really small, isn't it? Can anyone see that? I'm wondering whether I just carry on without that. Is that too small, guys? I'll start talking and see if we've got some feedback on that. So when we talk about, oh, now I've gone ahead. Okay, so we've already spoken that there's lots and lots of different ways of describing serviced accommodation. Okay, so you know it is small, but I think Naomi, but you can still see it. Okay, so let's press on, because we can always take a photo and make it bigger later when you want to come back and listen again. So in full screen, it's okay. Great, Daryl. Okay, so you've got your traditional holiday homes. So these are what we kind of maybe remember of old. You know, they've always been places, haven't they, where you can go with your family, go and stay by the seaside, and perhaps going to a hotel. Certainly we never went to a hotel. That was always very expensive, but you could maybe hire, you know, a holiday cottage or something like that. So that's very traditional. There are other areas that are all considered to be serviced accommodation, and that is assisted living. So that's a class C3B. Okay, so basically people receiving care. And also we've heard a lot about supported living, assisted living. This is a huge new kind of strategy where you basically have care providers who are really good at giving care but don't have much property experience, and you got property providers who are good at property but don't have much care experience, and they at the moment are starting to join together and doing some really, really fantastic stuff in that remit. So it's a really great one to understand. Then you've got things like short stay HMO. So certainly during COVID, that was a big shift of people converting their HMOs into short-term lets. Also on top of that, with the number of, with the cost of utilities and things raising and becoming more expensive, quite a few HMO landlords are happy to run at, say, a 60% occupancy, because guess when they're empty? They're more likely to be empty in the winter, when normally it would cost them a ton load of money to heat the place. So they're quite happy to be quite empty over the winter, and then make a lot more money per month, per night, from running short-term let. So that's a really interesting one as well. So that's C4, or obviously you've got sui generis HMO. You've got professional company let, so that's C3C. You've obviously got your Airbnb, so what we kind of understand the serviced accommodation. So you've got C1, so we've got a hotel, and that is C1. That is its actual use class. You've obviously got C3, so that's your normal dwelling place. So that is where you live. So I'm in an office in my house. It's actually a bedroom that we've painted. I've got my desk in here, but it makes a great office. So this is C3. This is your home, but it can also be your second home. So where you may go to, you know, you might have a nice place wherever, and that is your second home, and that is also classed as C3. And then you can have sui generis, which is basically lumped into everything else. So again, we've already mentioned you've got your hotels, your guest houses in your B&B, and they are classed as C1. So again, we talked about hotel. When you think of a hotel or a guest house, that is C1 use class. I've already mentioned my hotel, but it is actually, we call it an apartment hotel, because it is inherently lots of individual studio flats that make up the whole apartment. But ours is still C1, but you can have, you know, full size apartments that all make up an apartment hotel that can be classed as C1, but also each of those could individually be classed as C3, but it just runs as a hotel. So you can see here, you know, there's a lot of different parameters going on to understand this. Then you've got your co-living. So that's HMO, and that's generally on bigger sizes. That's sui generis. And then this made me laugh. I didn't really think of this. So Jonathan McDermott, as you can see, his link, his information is all at the bottom. And these are his slides that I've taken off the internet, off YouTube, and I'm going to put a link to it. And he is absolutely fantastic, by the way, is secure serviced accommodation. So that's prisons or detention centres. And that's actually class C2A. And it's very true, isn't it? You are given, a bed, you're given services, you're fed, you're watered, you've got access to a gym, you've got this, that, and the other, and it's only short term. It's not your principal primary residence, but it may be longer term for some than others. So that's also included in there. You also have hostels, and then of course you've got kind of caravan parks, holiday parks, and things like that. So you can really see there's an awful lot going on here. So many different kind of explanations of serviced accommodation. And certainly for us in the kind of world of understanding serviced accommodation, as you can see here, has always sort of inherently been, hotels, guest houses, and we would call C3 more your short-term rental property in just a normal house. But there's been so many descriptions thrown out there that it really does cause quite a lot of confusion, and most it's called sort of serviced accommodation. But I do still prefer short-term rental. And actually, I can see a couple of you on here who know and in fact are reading my manuscript. So I've got a book coming out, and it's a real decision whether to put serviced accommodation or short-term rental. But a lot of us, and especially Boostly, Mark Simpson, I know 𝗕𝗿𝗀𝗍𝗍 from Noki Stays, we all talk a lot more about short-term rental because it just makes the whole description much clearer, because obviously with serviced accommodation, you could be talking about a prison. So that's where I like to and prefer to talk about short-term rental. So what is happening? So already, if you are in Scotland, Northern Ireland, in Wales, there are already kind of things in place that are kind of, I don't know whether it's helping them, but they already have elements, and whether it's licensing or whether it's planning, that already is in place in those areas. But in the UK, in England, we don't really have that understanding. They don't really know what's going on. They are obviously overwhelmed with what is going on, and there is a lot going on. So it has kind of fallen to the local councils, and I know a lot of kind of trainers around this would always say, oh, you should go and ask your local council if you can run it as an Airbnb or something like that. And that would always, I just go, oh my gosh, don't do that, because you'd speak to somebody, and no disrespect, you'd speak to somebody and you'd say, oh, I'd like to run my C3 residential property, like a home, as serviced accommodation. And of course, serviced accommodation to them sounds like a hotel. It sounds like a bed and breakfast. It sounds like those things. So they would quite often say, oh yes, you need to make a change of use for that, or put in a pre-planning application. And inherently that just ticks the box in so many ways, because it means ka-ching, that's some money coming into the council. And then if they come through that, they might go, oh yes, and then actually yes, if you're running it as serviced accommodation, you do need it to be C1. Whereas actually there was, up until now, majority of C3, your own home, your own dwelling, was run perfectly fine for short-term rental. So kind of under that booking.com and things like that. And that has been absolutely fine. So it's been a lot of kind of confusion up until now, and it's been down to the local council, and inherently that poor person on the end of the phone just doesn't really know. And when you don't know, what do? You just advise them to go and make a pre-planning application, and you get a nice tick by your name because you've been bringing in some more money. So it's really key to understand that, everywhere has got kind of different thoughts. And then we've obviously got sort of London, which has the 90-day rule, and we'll go a bit more into that. And then you have got sort of other areas, Cornwall are bringing in various restrictions. So yeah, it's really important. And I think, one of the points that he's put there is there really isn't any compliance with regards to kind of health and safety. And one of the things, I don't know if you're aware, but there was the EPC debacle. So we had to have a really good EPC, and that's now been taken back. You don't have to anymore. But in serviced accommodation, it didn't matter what EPC you did, because it isn't somebody living there long term. It's somebody coming for maybe a week, and you yourself, as in the person running that business, is paying for the heating. So if you've got a really poor EPC and you're spending a lot of money on the heating, well, it doesn't really matter to the person staying there. Whereas it's very different if you've got a tenant who's on an ASD, an assured short hold tenancy, then they're going to be having to pay for the fact that your property is really poorly insulated, and they're therefore, I've had that before. I've stayed in a place and it was literally had oil, and it just, you could visibly just see it like going down like that. And it was like, oh, another refill. So, and it was always freezing, even with the hot heating blasting out. So it's really key to understand that with serviced accommodation, there's nothing there saying that you need all of these kind of health and safety measures that you have with a tenant. I mean, obviously we know that tenants, gosh, you have to have so many things in place to ensure that you are compliant, to ensure that your tenant is safe. And then if you ever needed to take your property back, or your tenant was not behaving in a nice way, because there can be some problem tenants, can't they? Then you have to have done it all correctly. If you didn't, then basically the tenant can run amok, and one small error can be a major issue. So either you want to make sure that you've got a really good letting agent looking after you, or you want to join something like the NRLA, the National Residential Landlord Association. They're really awesome. I'd highly recommend jumping into that. So that's already been set. You have to be really compliant in ASTs, in tenants, in buy to let. But with serviced accommodation, there's nothing. So you can understand that they are wanting to bring in these new measures to make it safe. And absolutely, this is really good, don't we? We really want to make sure that people are safe. I mean, that is really, really key. You have to make sure, especially things like fire safety. And so many people don't understand how to run a safe serviced accommodation. So if you feel that you're running a serviced accommodation that, for instance, has cleaning products left under the sink, that is not the right thing to be doing. So if you feel that you're not educated enough, please get yourself educated. There's so many people out there that can help. I even have a really cheap subscription, like £10 a month. You can join us for a couple of hours a month. I do mentoring. Lots of other people do. If you don't feel at this moment that you're running a professional ship, now is the time to get it, done. If you've been really, if you've, really educated yourself and you're running a great ship, then these are all really great news for us. Okay, so next up, so what is happening? Let me just do this. So what is happening in all these areas? Hold on, I can't quite see here. Okay, so already you can kind of just sort of see this yourself. But in Northern Ireland, they have a licensing scheme in place, and they do literally treat it as a change of use if it changes the character of the original property. So in Northern Ireland, they've got things in place. That is what they're going down with. In Wales, they've also had a recent change. They've actually got 2 use classes for serviced accommodation under C5 and also C6. There is PD, so that means permitted development. So that means you're basically allowed to move from one. So let's say from C3 to C5. They also have a mandatory licensing, and we will talk a little bit about that as well. They're talking about that. And then in Scotland, I mean, Scotland's kind of led the way. So just before COVID, they were introducing all this kind of short-term rental initiatives, and then it was kind of held back because of COVID, and then they kind of launched it, and then it was all fairly disastrous, really. It doesn't seem to be, it certainly wouldn't be somewhere where I would want to be investing at the moment. There's so many things in Scotland, but you know, there still aren't there many really successful investors in Scotland. But it's just, again, being educated, understanding. Hi, Dron, great to see you. So in Scotland, it is, you really got to understand, and they also have these control areas where planning permission is absolutely needed for serviced accommodation. And then in London, actually, there's been this kind of specific rule, and I'm not far away from London. I'm only an hour away from London. And for me, the 90-day rule is something that I've just never been interested, to be perfectly honest, in getting into. But as I say, lots of people are hugely successful in London. I believe that most of them would adhere to the 90-day rule, but I also do hear that other people maybe are a little bit more creative. Again, I can't judge that. I would always advise you to stick within the rules to run your business. But again, this is it. So if you don't understand the 90-day rule, what that is that you have, let's say we split the year into 4 sets of 90 days, basically. So let's imagine in the summer, you have 90 days in the summer, and that 90 days will be all short-term rental. So 2 nights here, 4 nights here. You've maybe got all the tourists coming in, visiting all the hot spots in London, and the whole 90 days is just full up of these short-term bookings. I mean, it can be 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 1 night, whatever it is, but it is a period where you can have short-term bookings, so shorter than 90 days. So once you've filled up that 90-day slot, then that's it. For the rest of the year, you can't have any more short bookings. Every booking outside of that needs to be 90 days or longer. So you're there thinking, well, what does that mean? Can I still run short-term rental? So imagine if you have high net worth individuals, for instance, who want to come over to the UK. Maybe they're coming in from the UAE, from Dubai or something, and they want to have 3 or 4 months in the UK. They'd like to have their own property, but they want to be really looked after. So they're happy to pay for, maybe weekly cleaning, daily cleaning, whatever it is. They may want concierge service, all of these things, but they want their own apartment. So they could book that for a longer period. You might also have contractors. They might be doing a 2-year job, and they're happy to book for 8 months. You could have a whole host of, you might have people who have moved offices. So they've moved from, I don't know, Manchester, they've moved to a new job in London, and they need to bring their whole family. And they are given a period of time in a serviced accommodation to help them, then give them time to find an actual place to live. I had that. I moved out to, where did I go? I moved out to Singapore. In fact, every place that I'd been, I was given a serviced accommodation. But I moved out to Singapore, and I was given just over a month in a serviced accommodation, so that during that month I could then go off and find my own place to stay. So these kind of things are quite normal in countries, in places. This has been going on for years and years and years, but that is inherently in the 90-day rule. So we already have that in London. And so that's, some people already carry on with that, and that works for them. Just having a drink. And guys, if you have any questions, do please let me know. And if we've had any surprises so far about how we describe serviced accommodation, or that we already have licensing in the other parts of the UK but not in England, then please do write me a comment. Let me know. It'll be really interesting to see where everyone's at in their understanding of this. So what is really important is up until now, it hasn't really been very clear, as I'd mentioned earlier, serviced accommodation, short-term rental, what exactly it is. We hear that serviced accommodation is, can be described as a prison. It can be, there's so many different discussions and so many different kind of use classes that can be described in this area. So what we have here is an actual description that has been brought in. So I'm just going to read it out. So it says short-term rental property or serviced accommodation will mean, and this is what the government are trying to ensure, that they cover every angle. So there is no chance that anyone is going to misunderstand. There's no chance that it could be misconstrued in any way. This is it, basically. So it is a dwelling or part of a dwelling which is provided by a person who is the host to another person who is described as the guest, for use by the guest as accommodation other than the guest's only or principal residence, in return for payment, whether or not by the guest, so it could be paid obviously by somebody else, and in the course of a trade or business carried on by the host. So it's definitely a business going on here. And then B, any dwelling or premises or part of a dwelling or premises not falling within the paragraph A, which I just said earlier, which is specified for the purposes of this paragraph. I always love this kind of jargon chat. So basically service accommodation will get its own definition. So it's not going to be a dwelling house, it's not going to be a C3 or an HMO or anything like that. It's going to have a completely separate definition of what it is, and it's talking about this use class 5. So it basically ensures that we are very clear that you have a hotel, that you have an HMO, that you have your own home, and then there is also this serviced accommodation or short-term rental. And then across the board, that will be the law. That will be the planning that you have to go about. But it is talked about being this, it is permitted development, and we'll talk about that just in a sec. Now he says here it's not time bound. So it's nothing to do. You don't have to worry about the 90 days or anything like that. And it will literally apply to England. Okay, so every single one in England, and on the day that this comes into effect, it will be across all areas, no matter if they already have something in place. So whether you're London, who's got the 90 days, whether you're Cornwall, who have kind of restrictions, everyone on that particular day will be the same. So I hope that kind of explains it. And we'll go on in a moment and just sort of explain. I'm just going to make sure I don't forget that. Next up. Okay. So we have this new use class, as we've been saying. And it basically is everything that we have said before. It is really key that the government want to have this very clear scenario where it's kind of, oh, Naomi, yes, very good. I'm going to come back to that. So it doesn't mean that the 90 days will be no more. It just means on that first day, everyone will be the same. So so everyone has this C5 introduction. Let me just so this C5 introduction. So we're all going to be the same. We're all going to have it. If you currently run as service accommodation, short-term let, and you fall into these categories, then you can have C5. But then what we have is we move into what is called the permitted development. Now, we understand that we will get permitted development rights. What does that mean? Okay, so what that means is, let's say you've got your home, and for want of a better description, you've actually bought a second home or whatever, and you're left with that home. What are you going to do with it? You've now been running it for a couple of years as a holiday let. It's doing really well for you, and you want to kind of continue. So you would, in the new world, be able to make use of the permitted development. So you are permitted to change the use class from C3, the dwelling house, to C5, the short-term let. And let's say then at the end of that period, 2 years, you suddenly go, you know what? We actually think we would like to utilize those funds for a bigger project. We want to sell a load of properties and actually accumulate the funds for a bigger project. So actually we'd like to sell it. Well, at that stage, you've got a C5, and maybe, and again, we don't know what it's going to be like in the future, do we? Maybe it would be better to sell that property as a C3 dwelling house. Maybe it really just works for a house, and it may reduce your market. And again, we don't know in the future, it may increase the value of it. But at the moment, there is probably going to be a bigger market, for instance, for a 3-bed house, in just people wanting to go and live there and have it as their own house. So they are going to want to purchase it as a C3, your own home, not as a C5, as a short-term let. So this permitted development allows you to go from C3 to C5, but then equally, it allows you just to go back again. So it is, you know, really, really useful to know that basically you can go from one to the other, and it shouldn't really make too much difference in this scenario. Now, one of the things that is kind of a bit of a concern for some, and I think this is definitely needs to be raised, there isn't anything that has talked about HMO to serviced accommodation or to short-term rental. So it would seem that if you currently have a C4 HMO or a sui generis HMO, so a much bigger HMO, to get to C5, it looks like you will potentially need planning permission. So just remember, this still is not in place. This is something that is looking to come in the summer of 2024. So if you haven't got, you know, if at the moment you're okay, but potentially you may need to get actual planning permission, whereas with permitted development you don't need to get actual planning permission. Now, the only thing that is, again, a bit of an unknown is we haven't been told whether we need prior approval or prior notification to get C3 to C5 from your home to a short-term rental property. So what does that mean? If you do need prior approval, that basically means you have to be able to tick a checklist, so to speak, of things that make it possible for you to change from C3 to C5. Again, you know, it would be a certain number of things, and if you can tick those, you put it into the, you know, you put it into your local council's planning, and if they don't come back to you within so many days, you can just go ahead and do that, because you've proven that you've ticked everything that's required for this prior approval. And if they don't come back to you within so many days, you can just go ahead and do it, and you've got that proof there. If they do come back to you, then obviously you would follow up to do whatever they say. At the moment, this has not been mentioned so much. We only hear about permitted development. We haven't actually had this kind of prior approval. So again, that's still an unknown. So that's something for us to be there. So this comes back to Naomi's kind of question about Article 4. So if anyone understands an Article 4 direction, if you know anything about HMOs, you will hear that all around the country, certain areas have something called an Article 4 direction. And what that means is, where normally you can have permitted development. So like we talked about, you are just allowed to change one use class to another. So you can, in most of the country, you can change C3, your own home, to C4, a small HMO. Okay, so you don't need to do anything, so to speak, as in apply for planning. It is permitted development that you're allowed to do that. However, in some areas, so similar to why, you know, this serviced accommodation stuff's brought in, there is, let's say, too many HMOs, and they feel that, you know, they're just taking away normal family houses. So therefore, they've brought in this restriction, which is known in generic terms as the Article 4 direction. And actually, when you have that, you cannot do C3 to C4. You actually have to make a planning application to kind of get over this. So most of the country currently do not have any restrictions for serviced accommodation, except a couple of places. Okay, so as Naomi has said, we have the 90-day rule, or the 90 days restriction in London. So on day one of this coming in, everyone across the country has exactly the same. So they will all have this permitted development rights. But because London already has a restriction, they will basically immediately be able to introduce an Article 4 direction, because they already had those restrictions beforehand. Yeah. So basically, they're not suddenly adding on a new restriction to all those people in their area. These people already are used to it. They're already doing it on a day-to-day basis. So it seems, doesn't it, perfectly fair that on day one, the law, or, you know, the new planning rules come out, and London will be allowed basically to pop in their Article 4 restriction, because it's already what's been done before. But there are other areas, like, so Cornwall have some restrictions. So again, they would be, it would seem normal that they would be allowed to do that. But it is unlikely that just a totally new area that has no restrictions, when the new use class comes in, that they suddenly put in an Article 4 restriction, because that can cause a lot of issues, can't it? That could cause a lot of problems for local businesses, for serviced accommodation providers, all of these things. And actually, they can be kind of charged potentially for these things. So generally, and again, this is a generalization, and I know it's something that Jonathan McDermott talks about, is that you are going to be waiting kind of generally about a year to get a new Article 4 into place, to have everyone, to give everyone that chance to kind of understand it. So generally, if your area currently has no restrictions around serviced accommodation or short-term rental, and obviously in the summer, this new permitted development comes in where you have a C3 dwelling, your own home or whatever, could be changed to C5, then there should be no restrictions. But they might want to bring in restrictions, but you will have a period of time where they basically have to, you know, get it passed or whatever, and ensure that they can bring in it. So generally, if you currently don't have a restriction in your area, when this comes in, it is unlikely that you will get this Article 4 restriction direction coming in immediately. So there will be this kind of delay, but of course there will be some areas that kind of bring it in. I know there's some areas that have brought in Article 4. I've got one near me. I'm not entirely sure why they brought it in. It doesn't really seem to be pertinent, but I do know that they had a few complaints and they just kind of brought it in to keep everyone, well, to keep the few complainers happy. Is that right or wrong? That's not really for us to comment. So again, what is really kind of key here is to remember that if you currently run serviced accommodation or short-term rental, you will get something called grandfather rights. And this is really, really key. So does anyone understand grandfather rights? It basically means if you're doing it now, you'll be able to carry on doing it. Okay, so what's really important, you may have heard that, especially sort of with HMOs, that you may have heard something called a certificate of lawfulness. If you haven't, what that basically means is if you'd been running an HMO for 10 years, then before all the licensings came in, as long as you had proof of that and you can prove that it has been running as an HMO, everything about it, it's all done correctly, you should be able to apply and get a certificate of lawfulness. And so you don't have to go for the planning permission. So grandfather rights within the serviced accommodation will be similar. Make sure you keep all of the documentation around your property. So, when you put it onto the market on OTAs, when you take your bookings, make sure you've really got great paper trail showing exactly what you were doing. I would also highly recommend, initially when you go on as a business, you still have to run with council tax, but as soon as you can, definitely look at converting into business rates, because then you are definitely running a business from that property and it will definitely fall into that. So again, it is not something to be scared of, and in fact, this is going to be a shake-up. There are going to be people who are going to be frightened of these changes. So I'd highly recommend, if you're wanting to do serviced accommodation, now is a really great time. Get out there, really, grab those properties, whether you're buying, whether you're doing rent to rent, any of those kind of things. Do jump onto that, because it's just a great opportunity. There will be people falling out of the market. There will be people that kind of a little bit overwhelmed by that, who potentially also don't run a good ship. They might not be running a very good property, and actually it's going to be a real pain for them to change maybe the furniture to be to adhere to fire regulations, because there will be more regulations that come in. There's already more regulations about fire safety. It is going to basically end up being similar to something like HMOs, fire doors, all of those kind of things. But it does always make me laugh. You can shove a huge family in a house and you don't have to have any safety barely in there at all. And they can, not be safe. But when you do it in this way, everything has to be done. So it is really, really key that we push forward and really ensure that if you need to have at some stage later a certificate of lawfulness, you have been running a serviced accommodation or short-term rental, that will work for you. So let's go on again. Okay, so then it is all about this kind of mandatory registration. So they call it a mandatory national register. So why are they doing this? Is it Big Brother looking at you? Is it that like, oh, why is that? It's basically because they're completely out of control. They do not know what is going on. As far as the number of properties, all of these people doing it. So they really want everyone to let them know what is going on and what this kind of mandatory sort of registration will be. Now, at the moment, it isn't, it isn't supposedly a license, so to speak, like we know it with the HMOs, but it will come to that. I mean, already I understand in Scotland, I think it's like £1,000 to apply. So these things, will probably trickle down. Is this a terrible thing? No, absolutely not. The same as with HMOs. I don't know about anyone else, but when I was at uni, my HMO was disgusting. I mean, it was so terrible. And people can go to prison now for the kind of accommodation that I lived in. So for when my kids, if they go to uni, they will not be experiencing the horrific accommodation that I experienced, because we now have this licensing. We now have these standards to keep properties at. And I think personally, that's a really great thing. So again, let's not be fearful of these things. It is all for positive. It is all to ensure that our properties are run really well, that our clients are kept safe. All of those kind of things are so key. So again, it's all about being knowledgeable. It's about understanding what is in it for us and how we can make that work. So basically, that is kind of me nearly in a nutshell. So all I would say is it's not in yet. It's coming in the summer. We don't know exactly, you know, what it will definitely be, but pretty much it's going to be what we've talked about for the last 50 or so minutes. If you are not running a good serviced accommodation unit, I would highly recommend doing some bits about it now. Oh my gosh, I just had a comment. I'm so sorry. That is so inappropriate. I've never seen anything like it before in my life. And I'm certainly not going to be answering it. That has nothing to do with property. And I'm slightly red, so apologies there. Yes. So yeah, it's not something to be frightened of, but it is really key that you really educate yourself and understand exactly what it is that runs a good business around short-term rental. You will then have grandfather rights. So it means that you can just carry on and run it as you are and carry on. At one stage, you may need a certificate of lawfulness, all of those kind of things. And, you know, it's really key and important to understand that. So, yeah, if anyone's got any questions, throw them out there. It's been a really, really good session. I know that a lot of people are feeling very worried, but inherently, if you haven't got restrictions in your area, that will basically mean that the new, you know, planning use class will come into place, but you should be fine. You'll get these grandfather rights unless there are already restrictions. If there are already restrictions, then they are likely to immediately bring in the Article 4 direction. But if not, it is highly unlikely that they will bring in an Article 4 direction at that moment. They will, you know, there will be a period of time before they will bring that in. And again, because you have the grandfather rights, then, you know, you should be able to move through that. But again, it's there is a little bit of unknown, but it's all good. So yeah, I hope that was helpful. If you've got any comments for me, please let me know. That would be fantastic. And as I say, if you need any help, this is a really great time to come in, to share your worries, to share your thoughts. I run a really fantastic I run a really fantastic subscription service. It's got a launch price. It's just £10 a month. And we do 2 to 4 hours of just talking about this, talking about people's businesses around property, serviced accommodation. And I also do some fabulous mentoring as well, which I can see a few of my lovely mentees are on here. So if you want any help, then do let me know. Okay, so we've got another one. Say, would you say buying an apartment is a good investment? I've heard saying a block of flats with a house is a better choice for long term. Oh, so Cam, what is good? So would you say buying an apartment is a good investment? Block of land with a house is a better choice for long term. So really, Cam, it really depends what your end goal is. So it's always about starting with the end in mind. And if we're talking about serviced accommodation, kind of all of these properties will work. I mean, gosh, you can have like a boat, you can have a tree house, you can have a flat, and you know, you can have just a piece of land with a yurt on it, or you can have a house. All of those things will work for serviced accommodation, but it's all about what it is. So you've spoken about a price range. So I started with literally no money for property, and I started in a rent to rent. So that's also really great. And I actually had lots of apartments in one block. Now, obviously, that's where education comes in. You have to make sure that it's allowed. We've really got to do everything above board. So you've got to make sure that, you know, the lease allows it, that the management company allows it, that if you're renting it off somebody who has a mortgage, that the mortgage company allows it, all of these different things. But inherently, it's kind of looking at where you are, what's financial resources you have, what knowledge resources you have, pooling those together, and then finding somebody to help and support you. I would recommend Cam, and definitely you can do amazing things. If you've got you've got a farmer with a bit of land, you have got the ruling where you can basically run a business on land for a certain number of days without having to have planning permission. So absolutely, it is really great. So so that's all really, really good. Okay, guys. Well, look, thank you so much for your time. If you need any more help, then we will put a link to me. I have all my, so I know we've gone across lots of platforms. We've even been on Instagram today. So I feel terribly modern. And I know my kids will be horrified. But if you've got any questions, do write them in the chat, and we will do absolutely everything to help and support you here. So again, really appreciate you being here. I will be here next week and back again at midday, giving you more content and helping you on your journey in property. Okay, guys, thank you so much. Let me I don't even know how to I was gonna just here we go, stop sharing. Then I've got a picture of me and I can say thank you so much, and take care, guys, and see you next time.